I'm assistant professor over at WMed, also known as Western Michigan University Homer Stryker MD School of Medicine, or mercifully abbreviated as WMed. So I want to start by thanking the Winnie Veenstra Endowment for Lectures on Peace for sponsoring this annual Peace Lecture. My thanks to my friend and colleague John Milgram, the interim director of the Center for the Study of Ethics in Society, and the board of the Ethics Center, of which I'm a member, for inviting me to deliver this lecture. At Western, I'd like to thank many of those in the Department of Philosophy, including the chair, David Paul, and Dr. Fritz Oloff for their support of my scholarship and for making me feel welcome at Western and in Kalamazoo, where I've been for just under 2 years. I would also like to thank my colleagues in the Department of Medical Ethics, Humanities, and Law, Drs. Parker Crutchfield, Michael Redinger, and Tyler Gibb, for their support and encouragement. Many of my colleagues from WMed are here this evening. I'm grateful for their supportive attendance, and I want to thank them in advance for their softball questions, as they were paid to have. Okay, so this talk is intended to offer a Kantian argument for pacifism. So by pacifism, I mean the view that harming others without their consent is necessarily, all things considered, morally impermissible. By Kantian, I mean that the argument draws substantively from the ethics of Immanuel Kant. So this combination of views will already have turned off multiple readers, or listeners in this case. Pacifism is a much derided view that virtually everyone rejects, aside from cranks and Panglossian religious enthusiasts, as Jeff McMahon once quipped. Kantian ethics, while enjoying far more acolytes than pacifism, continues to be battered about by its heavyweight rivals, consequentialism and virtue ethics, in a three-way boxing match, despite the late Derek Parfit's infamous plea that we all get along and climb the mountain of ethical theory together. Combining these two views that roughly 2/3 of professional philosophers regard as false may lend itself to the impression that I'm fond of self-sabotage, but such a charge would be exaggerated. So first, while my arguments can avoid commitments to some ethical theory or other, many cannot. Yet the latter arguments are nonetheless often worth making despite their lesser ecumenicism. Second, while I am sympathetic to the broad contours of Kantianism, the argument for pacifism that I develop in this talk is only moderately Kantian in flavor. For example, it appeals to the value of humanity, but not the formula of humanity. Nor does my argument invoke universalizability as a criterion for permissibility or obligation, although it's consistent with thinking that universalizability is required for one or for both. So famously, Kant himself was not a pacifist. But then Kant was not many things that he should have been, given his own theoretical commitments. Christine Korsgaard, for example, has convincingly argued that Kant should have held a much loftier view of non-human animals, embracing them as beings to whom we have directed duties. I'm not a Kant scholar, and nor do I seek to bore my audience with a tedious exegesis of Kant, so I will instead simply record my long-held belief that Kantian ethics more naturally leans pacifist than not. The argument I develop in this paper, or in this talk, indirectly justifies this belief. So at the core of Kant's ethics is a commitment to the view that persons are valuable, quote, beyond all price. There's deep disagreement among Kant scholars about what Kant meant by this. However, one significant, if not dominant, tradition reads Kant as embracing the view that persons have infinite moral value. Moreover, that value is intrinsic to them as persons, rather than merely instrumental or predicated on some contingent property they have. On this view, then, to be a person is to have infinite moral value in and of yourself. If persons have infinite moral value, what does this imply about our obligations to them? Presumably, there's some connection between the value of a thing, that's what we sometimes call axiology, and our obligations regarding it, or deontics. Consequentialists claim that we should promote good things and reduce bad things, that we should promote greater goods over lesser goods, and that we should reduce greater bads over lesser bads. For them, the connection between value and obligation is thus rather straightforward. For non-consequentialists like me, the connection isn't quite this simple. But it would be surprising, if not shocking, to discover that the infinite value of persons has no bearing on our obligations to them. My argument assumes that there is a presumptively positive correlation between a thing's value and our obligations to that thing, such that whatever obligations we have toward X and Y, if X has significantly greater value than Y, our obligations toward X are presumptively stronger than they are toward Y. So combining and formalizing these two claims about the value of persons and the deontic implications of such value provides us with the base ingredients for my pacifist argument. Of course, other ingredients are needed, and a good recipe is more than mere ingredients. But what I propose to do in the remainder of the talk is to shape these base ingredients into the following product, which is the core argument. So this is the infinite value argument for pacifism. Premise 1 states that each and every person has infinite and intrinsic moral value. Premise 2 says that our epistemic reasons for harming a person without their consent ought to be roughly proportionate to that person's value and the significance of the harm you will inflict. From this, it follows that our epistemic reasons for harming a person without their consent ought to be roughly infinitely strong. Premise 4 says that necessarily our epistemic reasons are never even roughly infinitely strong, and therefore we are never justified in harming a person without their consent. So I defend the first substantive premise of the argument, which I call value infinitism, in section 2 of the talk. Then in section 3 of the talk, I defend the proportionate reasons requirement and the claim that our epistemic reasons are never even roughly infinitely strong. And then I conclude. Okay. So the thesis defended in this section is called what I call value infinitism. And value infinitism, to repeat, is just the view that each and every person has infinite and intrinsic moral value. So I wish to leave open whether the category of person includes or excludes primates, cetaceans, or other non-human animals. And because of that, I won't offer a definition of the term here. My own view is that all conscious individuals, that is, individuals with a point of view for whom things can go better or worse from their own point of view, are persons. But I wish to isolate that view and debate surrounding it from the arguments I will be making here. In place of a definition, I will instead point to a paradigmatic example of personhood: human adults. Whatever one's view of personhood, the average human adult qualifies as a person. The set of average human adults is, we might say, the median set of persons. Value infinitism should furthermore be understood to be about persons themselves rather than their lives or interests or other matters. So when I claim that a person has infinite value, I do not mean that the quality of their life is of infinite value, a claim that's surely false, since almost any life could be better than it in fact is. Here I follow David Velleman in holding that, quote, things that were good for you would not actually merit concern unless you merited concern. Daniel Samasi characterizes Velleman's view of persons as having an interest-independent value, and the rationale behind it being that there must be a value to human beings that is prior to their interests and prior to their rights. So I will present two arguments for value infinitism. The first is what I call the equal value argument, and is defended by the philosophers Andrew Bailey and Joshua Rasmussen. The second is what I'll call the value conferring argument, as it was developed by Kenneth Walden. Okay. So in their 2020 article, How Valuable Could a Person Be?, Andrew Bailey and Joshua Rasmussen advanced two arguments for value infinitism. I will set aside their second argument, which they call the instrumental difference argument, since I think it's the weaker of the two arguments. Instead, I'll focus on their first argument, which they call the confirmation argument. But I will focus specifically on an unnamed sub-argument that Bailey and Rasmussen advance, which they describe as a fruitful and promising argument for a similar conclusion as the confirmation argument. I'll refer to this sub-argument as the wild coincidence argument. Because I like fun names. When fully fleshed out, I call the conjunction of the confirmation argument and the wild coincidence argument the equal value argument for value infinitism. So Bailey and Rasmussen's starting premise is that persons have extreme moral value, which they describe simply as the thesis that a person's value seems to surpass the value of many other things. To this, they add what I'll call the equal value thesis, which says that each and every person has equal intrinsic moral value. This thesis is familiar to most of us, and is a frequent starting place for ethical theorizing. Although we may differ from one another with respect to our instrumental value, since each of us contributes a different mixture of good and bad to the world in ways that others value or disvalue to differing degrees, our intrinsic or final value remains equal. Like any moral thesis, the equal value thesis has its detractors, which I lack the time or space to review here. Suffice it to say, the equal value thesis is well and widely defended in contemporary ethical theory, and I will assume its truth for now. So keeping fixed the equal value thesis, let's contemplate the various ways persons differ from one another. I've already mentioned that persons differ significantly in their instrumental value, but they also differ in other ways. Bailey and Rasmussen outline a number of these. They say, quote, like paintings in an art exhibit, we differ wildly in color and size and shape. We differ in all matter of non-moral properties. We differ in all matter of moral properties too. Some of us are well-behaved and disposed toward kindness or courage, others significantly less so. Like paintings, we also differ wildly in our capacity to produce other kinds of goods, money, food, pleasure, awe, and so on. But despite these differences, each person has no more or less intrinsic moral value than another. How is that the case? So here Bailey and Rasmussen compare two hypotheses, value infinitism and value finitism, the latter being the thesis that each and every person has finite intrinsic moral value. So using a Bayesian confirmation framework, they argue that the equal value thesis is much likelier given value infinitism than given value finitism. If value infinitism is true, then all persons have infinite and therefore equal value. By contrast, if value finitism is true, then all persons must have the same finite value, a surprising and improbable result. So as the authors argue, it would be quite surprising, given value finitism, that we are all deeply and equally valuable. For equal value would require that there be some particular finite degree of value, 61.2 axons, for example, such that we are each valuable to exactly that degree. Given our variation along other dimensions, this particular equality would be a surprising result indeed. It is possible, yes, just as it is possible that all the paintings in our parable have the same degree of value. But equal finite value across wide diversity is surprising and unexpected. This, they argue, is strong evidence for value infinitism. So more formally, this is what they call the confirmation argument. It says, premise 1, all persons have equal value. Premise 2 says the probability of the first premise being true given value infinitism is 1, whereas the probability of the first premise given value finitism is low. If that's the case, then the claim that all persons have equal value is strong evidence for value infinitism, and therefore the claim, or the fact that all persons have equal value, is strong evidence for value infinitism. So as somebody who's a fairly contented Bayesian, I'm at ease accepting the underlying Bayesian framing behind the confirmation argument. But like Bailey and Rasmussen, I recognize that not everyone endorses Bayesianism as a theory of probability. And for these reasons, the authors helpfully offer the following argument for non-Bayesians, which I call the wild coincidence argument, that establishes a similar conclusion. So it says, there is a kind and degree of value that we all share. If that's the case, then if that kind and degree of value is finite, then it is a wild coincidence that we all share it. Premise 3 says, it is not a wild coincidence that we all share it, and therefore that kind and degree of value we all share is not finite. So this argument repeats the basic abductive gist of the confirmation argument, that value infinitism better explains the equal value thesis than value finitism. But unlike the confirmation argument, the wild coincidence argument stops just short of explicitly endorsing value infinitism. So when we add the necessary premises, we have the equal value argument. So this is, again, my reconstruction. All persons have equal intrinsic moral value. If that's the case, then either all persons have infinite or finite intrinsic moral value. If they all have finite intrinsic moral value, then it's highly unlikely that all persons have equal intrinsic moral value. If, by contrast, if all persons have infinite moral value, then it's highly likely that all persons have equal moral value. And therefore, it's highly likely that all persons have infinite moral value. So the equal value argument, as defended in parts by Bailey and Rasmussen, provides strong evidence for value infinitism. Having now outlined the argument and explained its rationale, I won't say anything further about it here in its defense, and will refer readers who aren't yet fully persuaded to the full article by Bailey and Rasmussen. I can also talk a bit about it in the Q&A. So turning now to the second argument for value infinitism, Kant claims that persons are infinitely far above all price, such that their value, quote, cannot at all be brought into computation or comparison without, as it were, mistaking and assailing its holiness. Kant was a bit of a drama queen at times. I like him for this. So recently, Kenneth Walden developed an original defense of Kant's route to value infinitism. So Walden's defense begins with some abstract theoretical principles and constraints about the nature of value. His discussion's rich and worth examining in detail, but a brief examination of one of these principles should suffice for present purposes. This principle is what Walden calls the superiority of value conditions, which says that if y is the aggregate of the value conditions of x, then the value of x must be less than or equal to the value of y. Call this principle superiority. Value conditions are what grounds a thing's value. A thing is valuable because it constitutes, causes, realizes, or otherwise secures these things. What the above principle claims is that nothing can be more valuable than the aggregate of its value conditions, more valuable than the mereological union of all of its value conditions. This is why Walden argues, quote, it would be surprising if $300 turned out to be more valuable than any of the classes of commodities that can be bought with that sum, or if a muffin turned out to be more valuable than the gustatory pleasure and nutrition that it provides. And nor can a thing be less valuable than its aggregate value conditions. So to grasp the second step of Walden's argument, it's first necessary to understand Kant's view that persons are conferrers of moral value. When something matters to me or to you, it takes on moral value. This is how many things get their value. My property, for instance, matters morally in the sense that you ought not destroy or abscond with it without my consent. And it matters that you avoid these activities because I value the integrity and possession of my property. There are various ways of accounting for the phenomenon of persons as value conferrers, but for now I'll presume that persons have this capability. What's interesting about persons is that while others can confer additional value on us, our value doesn't essentially depend upon them valuing us. Rather, our value is intrinsic to us as persons. So from this basic starting point, Walden makes the basic observation that persons can value any number of things. Indeed, we could, given enough time, value an infinite number of things. As an example of this, Walden invites us to imagine a person named Veronica, and that Veronica is the only person who exists, and that she values tea. Moreover, Veronica is a bit eccentric. Each time she imagines someone questioning or denying the value of tea, she not only affirms her valuing, but increases the amount she values tea by 1/4. As time goes on, Veronica's nature as a frenetic reasoner results in her increasing her valuation with greater frequency. Walden observes that while there are certainly practical limits on Veronica's valuation, for instance, she won't live forever, there aren't principled limits on it, and therefore the price of tea is open-ended. Similarly, there could exist a universe with an infinite number of valuers, each of whom confers value on things. The example of Veronica is esoteric, if not a little bit silly, but the point is that there are no principled limits on either how many valuers there are, how many things are valued by them, or how much they value those things. When combined with the superiority principle above, we get the following conclusion from Walden. Quote, because our humanity is the condition of the value of things, its value must be at least as great as the value of any of these things. This means it must have infinite value. So we can express this argument more formally as follows. So premise 1 says that each person is, in principle, capable of conferring an infinite amount of value. In other words, the aggregate value conditions of each person are infinite. Nothing can be more or less valuable than its aggregate value conditions, and therefore each person is infinitely valuable. So what's the proper response to the infinite value of each and every person? I will argue next that one proper ethical response to such value is the moral obligation to acquire sufficient evidence before harming them. But Walden's answer is a decidedly aesthetic one, to experience that person as sublime. This echoes Kant's famously beautiful remark that the two things that filled him with wonder were the starry skies above him and the moral law within him. Expanding on this, Walden writes, the appropriate response to the infinite value of a person is to feel both pleasure in the superiority you share with that person and humiliation in the inadequacy of your pricing activities compared to that value. This, of course, is not to offer any rules or formulae for acting in response to this value, but that is the point. The proper experience of the value of humanity is one of being overwhelmed, of being wrenched from our workaday practice of valuing, and we should hardly expect a rule to capture this. So moving beyond arguments for value infinitism, this next part of the talk defends two theses, the most important of which is the proportionate reasons requirement. So recall the proportionate reasons requirement says that our epistemic reasons for harming a person without their consent ought to be roughly proportionate to that person's value and the significance of the harm you will inflict. So it's already well established in contemporary ethics that the more significant the harm, the stronger justification needed. One way to think of this is in terms of thresholds when comparing two harms. Say, the minor pain of being pinched on the arm versus the major pain of being shot in the stomach. The weakest possible justification, say alerting someone to a social faux pas, for the former is too weak to justify the latter. As this view is uncontroversial, I'll say nothing further in its defense and again assume its truth. What hasn't yet been shown, despite, I think, being widely believed, is the claim that a person's intrinsic value impacts the calculus such that the greater value an individual has, the stronger justification is needed to harm them. One way to appreciate the difference between this component of the PRR and the former component is to distinguish, as Shelley Kagan does, between what the interest is, for instance, avoiding the pain of a pinch, versus whose interest it is, for example, a person's. As Kagan remarks, as I go on to argue for hierarchy in animal ethics, it is to be understood that I am indeed claiming that it matters whose interests we are talking about. More controversially, it hasn't been shown that justifying reasons of the moral and of the epistemic sort must track or map onto an individual's value by being roughly proportionate to that value and strength. So my defense of the PRR will focus on these more controversial components. The second thesis to be defended in this section provides auxiliary support for the infinite value argument and is as follows, which is premise 4, that necessarily our epistemic reasons are never even roughly infinitely strong. So while I will offer reasons to accept this auxiliary thesis, the bulk of my defense will be dedicated to the PRR, to which I now turn. So my defense of the PRR begins with the examination of epistemological duties. I'll say more about what these are in a moment, but as is often done, I'm going to begin with William Clifford's infamous claim that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. I had a professor in grad school who said that that claim was surely false, but that it's the closest a philosopher gets to saying something right before they cap them. And that's always struck me as right, even as a pacifist. So as an example of this, Clifford gave us the following thought experiment. And forgive the language, this was published in 1901. So a ship owner was about to send to sea an immigrant ship. He knew that she was old, not over well built at the first, that she had seen many seas and climes, and often had needed repairs. Doubts had been suggested to him that possibly she was not seaworthy. These doubts preyed upon his mind and made him unhappy. He thought that perhaps he ought to have her thoroughly overhauled and refitted, but even though this should put him to great expense, before the ship sailed, however, he succeeded in overcoming these melancholy reflections. He said to himself that she had gone safely through so many voyages and weathered so many storms that it was idle to suppose she would not come safely home from this trip also. He would put his trust in Providence, which could hardly fail to protect all these unhappy families that were leaving their fatherland to seek for better times elsewhere. He would dismiss from his mind all ungenerous suspicions about the honesty of builders and contractors. In such ways, he acquired a sincere and comfortable conviction that his vessel was thoroughly safe and seaworthy. He watched her departure with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home that was to be. And he got his insurance money when she went down mid-ocean and told no tales. So Clifford's uncontroversial claim is that the ship owner acted wrongly in this case. More controversial, however, is Clifford's explanation for the wrongness of the ship owner's act, which is because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. Thus, the ship owner is guilty of epistemic wrongdoing in addition to moral wrongdoing. Whether there are any epistemological duties independent of moral duties is a deeply controversial issue, so I'll set it aside for now. But what does seem clear is that the actions of Clifford's fictional ship owner are morally impermissible. It furthermore seems clear that before sending a full complement of people to sea, the ship owner should, morally speaking, have done his due diligence and ensured the vessel was seaworthy. That is, the ship owner had a moral obligation to gather more evidence. The thesis that moral obligations can have epistemic or evidential requirements is neither novel nor controversial, and cases like the ship owner demonstrate its plausibility. Within criminal law, for example, capital crimes carry greater evidentiary burdens than non-capital ones. And this is as it should be. These examples are meant to establish the more general position that there is sometimes a moral obligation to gather more evidence. What I'll now argue is that the moral obligation to gather more evidence is sensitive to the value of the individual affected. To do this, I will appeal to two popular cases of comparative moral status. These examples are only illustrative, however. So as the first supporting case, consider morally liable parties, as represented in the following thought experiment of attacker. So an attacker villain will murder victim unless victim kills villain. Coincidentally, villain and victim are the same age, in good health, and have descriptively identical interests. It would be just as bad for villain if he died as it would be for victim if she died. From the standpoint of unweighted interests, there's no moral reason to prefer one life to another. That's where weighted interests come into play. Most believe there is a good moral reason to prefer one person's life to another, namely, to prefer victim's life. According to the standard view, by culpably attacking victim, villain forfeits his right not to be killed, and the underlying interests supporting that right are therefore morally discounted. Thus, whereas victim and villain were once equals in moral status, villain's moral status has been demoted. In the ethics of war, most theorists agree that non-combatants, civilians, just henceforth civilians, are entitled to superior protections than combatants. There's disagreement over whether civilians are entitled to superior protections in principle or merely in practice, but this disagreement owes its existence largely to whether civilians ever satisfy one or more sufficient conditions for moral liability to defensive harm. This disagreement notwithstanding, most theorists agree that civilians should be protected from harms over combatants, never intentionally targeted, treated first for injuries sustained during armed conflict, and that collateral harms to civilians are worse, that is to say, they count more against proportionality requirements than collateral harms to combatants. So whether this difference in status is grounded in liability, for instance, combatants are liable to be harmed, but civilians aren't, or in consent, combatants consent to be harmed, but civilians don't, or something else, what's clear is that combatants' interests are morally discounted relative to civilians' interests. In practice, such discounted interest means that harming combatants is generally much easier to justify than harming civilians. One manifestation of this justificatory differential is epistemic. For instance, it's plausibly true that in order to be justified in killing a civilian, you need more evidence that killing them is necessary, proportionate, and so on, than you would need to be morally justified in killing a combatant. Among those who think it's sometimes permissible to wage war, most believe that it can be necessary, proportionate, and so on to kill civilians, albeit only as an unintended side effect, and even then only in rare cases where other stringent conditions are met. Nevertheless, our epistemic justification for believing killing a civilian is necessary, proportionate, and otherwise permissible should be stronger than our epistemic justification for believing that killing a combatant is necessary, proportionate, and otherwise permissible in order for such killing to be morally justified. As an example of this, let's suppose that the average combatant's interests are discounted 25% relative to the average civilian's interests. In that case, it's on average 25% easier to justify harming a combatant than it is to justify harming a civilian. For the sake of argument, suppose the moral requirements are such that at least 51% of your total evidence must support thinking that killing combatant is necessary, proportionate, and the like. If it's 25% harder to justify killing civilian, then it seems reasonable to think that at least 76% of your total evidence must support thinking that killing them is necessary, proportionate, and so on. Of course, it's almost surely true that non-epistemic or not purely epistemic considerations factor into the higher threshold for moral justification. But it seems eminently plausible that such a threshold would be comprised at least partially of a higher epistemic justificatory threshold. As a second example, consider two competing views about the comparative moral status of humans and non-human animals. Hierarchicalism, as I'll call it, is defended by Shelley Kagan and described by him as the view that statuses can vary and that, quote, some individuals have a higher moral status than others. In contrast, what Kagan calls Unitarianism is the view that all creatures withstanding have the very same moral status. On that view, there aren't degrees of moral value. Rather, something either has moral value or it doesn't, and those who have it equally. Most people, wrongly I think, but many people anyway, endorse hierarchicalism about humans versus animals, claiming that humans are more valuable than animals. They tend to believe then that it's harder to justify harming a human than harming an animal, even if they believe it's difficult to justify either one. In defense of this view, Kagan considers the proportionality restriction on permissible defense and says this, quote, the proportionality condition may actually be sensitive to both the status of the victim and to the status of the attacker. So to simplify Kagan's analysis somewhat, because the unweighted harm to both the animal and the human is the same, which is to say, death, the proportionality calculus ultimately comes down to the difference in value between the human and the animal. Humans are more valuable than animals, and thus the weighted harm to the human would be worse than the weighted harm to the animal. I mentioned previously that many persons endorse a hierarchicalist view like Kagan's. They believe that human animals possess greater, indeed often much greater, moral value than non-human ones. Kant himself believed this to be true. Because it's harder to justify harming things with greater moral value, hierarchicalists maintain that it's harder to justify harming humans than to justify harming animals. One respect in which it is difficult to justify harming humans is vis-a-vis stricter epistemic requirements. As example, consider 4 people, all of whom believe themselves to be threatened by different animals. This case is called 4 kills. Amir believes himself to be threatened by an ant, Betty by a bullfrog, Carlos by a crow, and Deepa by a dog. Amir, Betty, Carlos, and Deepa each kill the animal they believe threatens them. So how much evidence does each of these people need in order to be morally justified in killing the animal they believe threatens them? So most people will say that Amir needs little to no evidence that the ant threatens him in order to be justified in killing the ant. By contrast, Betty seems to need a bit more evidence than Amir does in order to be morally justified in killing a bullfrog. Intuitively, she would have acted wrongly if she killed the bullfrog in the absence of any evidence supporting her belief that the bullfrog is threatening her. For Carlos to be morally justified in killing a crow, he, like Betty, needs more evidence than Amir needs to permissibly kill an ant. Moreover, he seems to need more evidence than Betty does. Finally, Deepa needs significantly more evidence than Amir and Betty need, and arguably a fair bit more evidence than Carlos needs that the dog before her is in fact threatening her in order to be morally justified in killing the dog. What's noteworthy about these comparisons is that as the moral value of the animal increases, the epistemic requirements for morally justifying killing become stricter. So first, let's think about how most hierarchicalists rake the animal's moral values. I assume the average hierarchicalist endorses the following rough ranking, with the moral value of each species listed in descending order: dog, cow, bullfrog, and then ant. The difference in value between the species occupying opposite ends of our abbreviated spectrum, dog and ant, is typically believed to be quite large. Dogs are much more valuable than ants. I want to make sure that my dog heard me say that. Contrastingly, many people think the moral value differential between ants and bullfrogs to be quite small. Bullfrogs have more moral value than ants, but not by much. Second, let's consider the degree to which epistemic stringency grows for each person in the 4 kills case. We have already seen that it's very plausible to suppose that if the hierarchicalist is right in their comparative moral value judgments about each animal, then the epistemic requirements for moral justification are strictest for Deepa, followed by Carlos, then Betty, and finally Amir. But how much stricter is each iteration of the epistemic requirement? So the following 2 possibilities seem like the only plausible answers. According to strict reasons gradualism, you need strictly or merely stronger epistemic reasons to be morally justified in harming a more valuable being than a less valuable one. By contrast, according to proportional reasons gradualism, you need proportionately stronger reasons to be morally justified in harming a more valuable individual over a less valuable one. So which of these views should we prefer? There is, I think, a serious problem with strict reasons gradualism that gives a strong reason to prefer proportional reasons gradualism. So to explain, consider a more detailed version of the 4 kills case called 4 reasons. Amir has no epistemic reason to believe the ant threatens him. He merely forms this belief at random. Betty believes the bullfrog threatens her because it croaked once. Carlos believes the crow threatened him because it cawed twice. Deepa believes the dog threatened her because it barked thrice. For argument's sake, let's assume that a bullfrog's croaking, a crow's cawing, and a dog's barking are threatening behaviors. In that case, each person's evidence is stronger than the last. Betty's is stronger than Amir's, Carlos stronger than Betty's, and Deepa's is stronger than Carlos's. After all, the bullfrog behaved 100% more threateningly than the ant, the crow behaved twice as threateningly as the bullfrog, and so on. Let's assume further that Amir was morally justified in killing the ant. It's trivially true that Betty had stronger reason than Amir, since Amir had none. But does the mere fact that Betty had stronger epistemic reason, no matter how weak, justify her in killing the bullfrog? Plausibly not. But that contradicts strict reasons gradualism, according to which any degree of epistemic reasons enhancement is sufficient for moral justification. And this problem with strict reasons gradualism worsens as you go up the value chain. 3 barks provides more evidence than 2 caws, but even if 2 caws were enough to justify killing a crow, 3 barks isn't enough to justify killing a dog. So thus, we should reject strict reasons gradualism in favor of proportional reasons gradualism. And this brings us to the final step of the argument for the PRR. To what should our epistemic reasons be proportioned? The obvious answer is the moral value of the thing in question. According to most hierarchicalists, dogs aren't merely more valuable than crows, but much more valuable. Thus, the strength of our epistemic reasons needs to be relatively much stronger, not merely stronger, in order to be justified, morally speaking, in harming dogs than in harming crows. But as the arguments in section 2 have shown, persons have infinite value. Our epistemic reasons for harming them must, therefore, be roughly infinitely strong. But can our epistemic reasons ever be that strong? No, they can't. Epistemic reasons can be strengthened quantitatively, qualitatively, or both. But for any epistemic reason, it can be strengthened in any of these ways. There can, in principle, always be more reasons, stronger reasons, or both more and stronger reasons. Our evidence for believing something can always be better than it is. Even if we possess an epistemically decisive reason to believe a proposition, we could, again in principle, possess two epistemically decisive reasons to believe it. And thus, it's necessarily true that the epistemic reasons can never have infinite strength. They could always be stronger than they are. Okay, perfect timing. So I've argued that persons have infinite moral value and explored its implications for the permissibility of harming them. In particular, I've argued that persons' infinite moral value entails that it's very difficult to justify harming them, and that a key part of this difficulty is what morality requires of us epistemically. We need to be very sure, indeed proportionately sure, that we are acting rightly when we harm persons. We owe them that much. But being even roughly proportionately sure means being infinitely sure. And that's something that we cannot achieve, even in principle. Therefore, we cannot justify harming persons without their consent. A pacifist conclusion. Okay, so much of what I've said in this talk has been philosophically technical. So to anyone who's been alienated by this, I apologize. My goal is not to alienate, but rather to provide some rigorous argumentation for a view that I hold dearly. And my execution here reflects the philosophical training I have. So some people might be tempted to dismiss what I have to say here as kind of highfalutin mumbo jumbo with no practical application. But that's unfair. The view I have defended has sweeping practical application, and that does not make it any less action guiding. Of course, what I have said resists the view that being practical means being violent, but this is something I'm happy to resist. There's a long disagreement between those who believe that violent resistance is the likeliest means to achieve peace and those who believe nonviolent resistance is. In my view, there is ample and powerful evidence to believe nonviolent resistance has historically achieved far more success, but I leave that discussion for another time. I'd like to conclude with one practical takeaway, which I truly believe is needed for our dire times. We should value each other properly, resisting contemporary cynicism about persons and efforts to devalue them. We see much of this in contemporary political rhetoric, referring to persons as garbage, as worthless, as vermin, and the like. And I would remind everyone here of the dark places to which such rhetoric has historically led us. While I can't point to a single period in human history in which human persons have consistently valued one another as they should, it's obviously desirable to create such an epoch. It falls to each of us to do so, and I recommend that we begin by valuing persons as the infinitely valuable and wondrous beings that they are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Blake. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've got about 30 minutes roughly for Q&A, and we will follow the normal thing. If you have a question, raise your hand. Questions. If you have a quick follow-up, you can raise your finger or follow up to a current thread that's happening. Just a quick reminder, it is Q&A, so it's questions, not 10-minute slides. If that's what you want to do, talk to me. I'll be back next semester and we'll schedule your own talk in some way, shape, or form. Okay? All right. Anybody have questions?
I'll also take angry remarks. Yeah. Brief.
Okay, here we go. So, I mean, as a utilitarian who believes in war, I have a question for you. Okay. So, I mean, like maybe it's kind of like the case we had a few slides back called the victim and villain or something.
Oh, the attacker case?
Attacker. Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking of cases like that where, you know, say you're getting ready to detonate a bomb in this room that's going to kill all of us. I've got two options. I can shoot you or everyone in the room is dead. Those are the only two options in front of us. So I wonder how you're going to look at those kinds of cases. And I guess specifically, you kept saying you can't hurt someone without their consent. I wonder if let's just use the word terrorist. I wonder if you think the terrorist consents to being attacked if they find themselves in that situation. So is your pacifism like you can't stop the terrorist in that case, or is it that the terrorist has consented to being attacked, or how's your view on that?
Yeah, so I don't think the terrorist has consented to being attacked. I mean, I would think that the story you would want to tell there would be a forfeiture story rather than a, so I think of consent as kind of waiving your rights rather than a voluntary behavior. I don't think that the terrorist has consented. Now, what I mean by kind of carving out space, so I don't think that pacifism entails that consensual harming is permissible. I just want to leave room for that. So it seems to me that, and this is just my own view, right, is that it seems to me that there's nothing inconsistent with my saying I'm a pacifist and also saying that if two people want to, box with one another, voluntarily, consensually, that is not objectionable under a pacifist view. I think that sounds plausible to me. So going back to the kind of basic case, that's one in which the terrorist doesn't consent, and so you're not going to have right, you're going to need the kind of reasons, right, and you're not going to be able to have, infinitely strong reasons, right, to ensure that it's justified in harming it, and so you're not going to be permitted to do that.
Okay. What about the infinite values of the other people who stand to be blown up?
Yeah.
So even if I'm say I'm 90% sure the terrorist is really the terrorist, I have everyone else's values. And I know as a non-utilitarian, you're not going to aggregate them the same way that I would, but I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things is that the way, so there's some interesting literature on finite arithmetic and Cantor's issues, and they're well, if you pick a particular infinite cardinal or whatever, then you can avoid some of these problems with it. And I'm I don't know what to do with math stuff like that. But yeah, so I think that they don't aggregate in that kind of way. I don't think you want to say we've got a bigger infinite pile over here than over here, right? I don't like that sort of view. But I would think then there probably is some stuff about killing versus letting die, doing intending, right, that could probably make a difference as to what's permissible to do there. So I don't think it's going to cut in favor of the non-pacifists. So.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yes, please.
How is it idealist argument for pacifism more explicatory of social history than the labor theory of value, for example?
How is it more what?
Explicatory. How does it explain what's happened, say, in the last 100 years better than a labor theory of value?
It probably does. But I just don't think that matters enough, or is the only thing that matters. Yeah. I don't know that a theory of this sort is intended to explain things historically, right? I think normative positions often aren't intended to explain things historically. I think for somebody who's interested in thinking about pacifism as a kind of pragmatic approach to a non-ideal world, there's plenty to say about it. And there's a lot of interesting stuff out there that one could read or write or say about it. But I think on the normative kind of ideal side, that's where pacifism often gets dismissed, right? So there are a lot of people who will admire people like King and Gandhi and a lot of these nonviolent activists, and they'll give thumbs up to their pacifisms in this very practical sense, but they'll say, oh, but the kind of principled, idealistic, Jesus of Nazareth sounding, always turn the other cheek, that's just crazy, right? And part of this defense is to say, no, I don't think that's such an implausible view. I think that there are reasons that can be marshaled in defense of that view, and not merely in defense of this kind of pacifism as a practical approach to political change.
Okay.
Thank you. Great talk.
I'm curious about the relationship between being value conferrers and having infinite value, if there is one.
Okay.
I'm also curious whether, for instance, dogs maybe are value conferrers, right?
Yes.
Maybe my dog confers value, and maybe my cat confers value. And so I'm curious about the hierarchical view and whether value conferring capacity itself is hierarchical, and what role that might play in our understanding of all of this. Maybe I do have different obligations to a dog than a bullfrog because a dog is a different kind of value conferrer than a bullfrog is.
Yeah. So I'm not a hierarchicalist, but I think that like hierarchicalism is a common way of thinking about this. And it seems to me like, so, I mean, a lot of my undergraduate philosophical education was very theological in nature. And so like the great chain of being, you know, in Catholicism, right, where you're like, humans are at the top and then, you know, so on and so forth all the way down, right? Like that's idea. And the idea of like the way of thinking behind it is that like, well, you need really, really, really good reason epistemically, right, and morally to harm a human being or to kill a human being. You need less for a dog or for a horse, a little less, for, right, and so on down the chain until the point it's like, you can just kill mosquitoes willy-nilly, right? Like, and I'm like, well, that's a pretty natural way of thinking about things. I understand why hierarchicalists. So I want to borrow this idea that like our reasons need to map onto the value, but I just want to flatten the value. In some ways, I'm more Unitarian in my outlook. So I agree with Korsgaard and some others who think that like there are lots of non-human animals who are value conferrers in this way. My dog likes certain foods better than other foods. I joke that my dog won't take any food from me unless it has some kind of sauce on it. This is increasingly true. This was my mistake. I used to give her Cheerios, some of my Cheerios at breakfast. One time I gave her one with some cream cheese on it. And then after that I handed her Cheerios. She's like, what the hell are you doing, right? Like, why does this not have cream cheese? And she looked at it, smelled it, and went like that, right? So it seems like animals, right, a lot of non-human animals can confer value on things in these sorts of ways. So I'm pretty comfortable with thinking that. And I think you could, if you're a Unitarian who's like, should I be a pacifist for, you know, towards dogs, right? Yeah, I think you could probably run a similar argument. My dog could, in principle, value an infinite number of things, right? And so the boundaries of the aggregate conditions of the value, right, are the same, you know. They may be different kinds of things, right, that my dog values. That's certainly going to be the case, but that's also certainly going to be the case between lots of different human beings, right? Veronica really values tea, right? I really don't. But I value Veronica, right? So I value the things she values. Yeah. I don't know who's next, John. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting. I'm wondering if you could talk more about the concept of consent in your work, because apparently it's very different in social sciences how we understand consent. Especially, I think your major argument here is to talk about we should not harm anyone without their consent, right? So, like, I am wondering, would anyone consent to be harmed? So, could you explain a little bit more about the concept in philosophy?
Yeah. So, so one is, I think, in a very intuitive way, yes, people consent to be harmed in a number of cases. So I have friends who box for fun, right? So when they get into the boxing ring, they understand that they're going to be taking shots at one another, or they play paintball, or they do these kinds of things. And when they play these kinds of games with the understanding that, you know, I'm going to shoot paintballs at you, if they hit you, and I hope they will, it will hurt, right? My goal is not to hurt you for pain's sake, but for the point of the game. And similarly in boxing, yeah, I think people are consenting to being harmed in those circumstances. I think people probably consent to be harmed in medical situations, right? I'm a cancer survivor, and when I went through chemotherapy, I think I consented to be harmed in a variety of ways. Now, on the whole, I think it was a benefit to me, but individuated, I think a lot of those things were really harmful. So is that way of talking about consent very different to the way you're thinking about it in social sciences? And if so, how is it different?
Like in social sciences, when we talk about consent, it means that we need to explain to our subjects the benefits and the costs to get their informed consent, for them to understand everything about what we are going to do to them, like conducting the interview or like participating in their activities. So that's why I think maybe in philosophy it's different.
Well, so I don't think giving somebody that information is the whole story of consent. If you give all of that information to somebody and then they say, no, I think they haven't consented. So them consenting is them giving this kind of informed, right, decision, right, where like a kind of giving an informed assent to it. So you're thinking of like a procedural kind of informed consent. And I think that's important in a lot of contexts. I think for other contexts, though, it's not as procedural in that way. So I think the way that a lot of people consent to sexual relationships isn't like that, right? I don't hand you a form and say, here are the various ways in which you might benefit from having sex with me. Here are the ways in which you might be harmed from having sex with me. Given all of that, do you care to sign on the dotted line? I would like a witness, right? Like, no, we don't do that. It's much more informal than that. But I mean, so that's not to say it's not important. I mean, part of the importance is documentation, right? To show, to demonstrate that you had informed consent. But I take that to be separate from the consent itself. Yeah. So I actually don't think we're too dissimilar in the ways we're thinking about it. I think if you're just thinking of consent, if you're thinking of like an informed consent as a procedure, as a policy, then yeah, it's got a lot more bells and whistles. But I think fundamentally the idea that a person knows what they're doing and they agree to it, that's what's at the core of consent. Christine Korsgaard sometimes calls it power over the proceedings. It's this idea that you're the one who decides what happens in and to your body or in your world, whatever. So I think, yeah, we're probably not that far apart. I don't know who's next.
Yeah. How does your view or this view take into account threats of violence?
Okay, can you say more?
Like in Dr. Alhoff's example, the terrorist is going to blow up the bomb, but we can prevent that through egregious acts of threat. Does it have to be physical violence, I guess?
Yeah. So if the question is whether a threat of violence itself counts as an instance of violence, I'm inclined, I don't know. My intuition is no, but there, I think, is a separate question of whether or not, if you're somebody who thinks that violence is categorically off the table, non-consensual violence is categorically off the table, whether it's permissible to threaten something that you think is wrong, right? So I think, for instance, a lot of people hold this view of like sexual assault, or they'll hold this view of torture, right? Not everybody, right? Like Fritz has like a whole literature on ticking time bombs and torture and stuff like that, right? But for, let's say, somebody who's categorically opposed to torture, right? And they're like, well, I think it would be wrong to do it always, everywhere, and for anyone. Does that mean it would always be wrong to threaten to do it? You can't follow through on the threat. You're bluffing, right? But would it be wrong to do that? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a strong view on that.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm thinking of is the difference traditionally in the law between battery and assault.
Yeah.
Battery meaning the physical touching, and assault meaning the creation of the situation in which the person perceives in which they will be involuntarily touched. And are those two things equally wrong in the pacifist view?
The creating of the conditions.
In which the person believes they will be.
Probably not. I mean, a lot of ways in which you could create the conditions in which somebody might feel that way that are pretty innocuous, right? Or not very clearly wrong, right? I might unknowingly, right? Find out that somebody in here, like suppose I don't know that somebody in here is a terrorist and that all they're waiting for is for one of these doors to be closed before they kill everybody, and I'm the last one in here for the lecture. I'm like, oh, then I've created the conditions, right? But I mean, it doesn't seem to me that that's a case in which.
Well, I think a common example is like, if I punch somebody
Yeah.
and they see the punch coming, I've assaulted and battered them. If they're assaulted and I punch them, I've battered them, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I act like I'm going to punch them, then I've assaulted them without battering them. So there's 3 different situations in which my actions have, under your view, either harmed or should be prohibited or not, or wrong in some way.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing so I don't know what I think is the short answer. The longer answer, a slightly longer answer is, one thing a pacifist could say is that they're all wrong, always, everywhere, for anyone, but that some of them are worse than others. Now, I think a fair response to this is to be like, well, what about favoring like a lesser harm principle? Shouldn't you be like, well, all of these are bad, but one of them is less bad, so shouldn't we do the one that has less bad, right? And there, I think the pacifist is going to have to say something like, yeah, I mean, there's a certain threshold at which, right, if it reaches this threshold of badness, you're not permitted to execute even the least bad, right, option. Yeah, and I mean, this is where people have, I think, additional issues with pacifism. That there are things I have to say about it, but yeah, I would want to think more about these legal distinctions and whether they make a difference for a kind of normative pacifism. Yeah, thanks.
Right. So, I don't have all of the highfalutin.
Oh, well, I just wanted to use highfalutin in a talk.
Highfalutin.
Now I have it. Yeah.
So it's a good.
Here we go. Yes, here we are. Sublime. Yes.
So what I was thinking about was your earlier comment about personhood and how you were not willing to limit that to only humans.
Yeah.
But then we were taking into account an entire series of zoology where we were looking at ants and amphibians and birds and mammals. And I was thinking, given what we continually learn about the cognition of animals and how it seems like the more we learn about it, the more we realize they have way more cognition than we thought.
Oh, yeah.
So then it becomes a question of, do each of those, in context of what you've said, do they then effectively each have that infinite value?
So one thing comment on this is the writer Franz de Waal has a wonderful book that came out, it's almost 10 years ago now, called Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And the answer is no, right? I mean, I think is the answer of the book. But he goes through and talks about how there's this long history of anthropologists and zoologists and people who were opposed to thinking non-human animals matter, like neo-Cartesians and all these people being like, oh, well, there are all these, in order to have rights or to matter, morally speaking, you've got to have a theory of mind. And then it turns out that some human beings don't have this theory of mind and some non-human animals do. And so then they're like, well, you've got to be able to use tools. And animals don't use tools, but humans do. And then it turns out we find out non-human animals use tools, and actually a bunch of different species use tools. And all right, there's species of birds that use tools. And so I think, yes, again and again, we've discovered that A, we are not as smart as we think we are, and B, they are much smarter than we think they are. Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to think that once a thing has a kind of conscious experience where things can go better or worse from its point of view, it's not that they have to care about something in particular, it's that they're capable of caring about something in particular, that's the threshold for moral status, or at least it's sufficient for moral status. And so I tend to think that dogs and cats, and right, certainly mammals, chordates, right? I don't know what I think about certain kinds of insects and arachnids, right? Because I think sometimes the jury's out on whether or not they have central nervous systems or consciousness or things like this. But yeah, I think that they've all got its moral status and probably have it. And I mean, once they have it infinitely, I think. So I'm a Unitarian about value. Yeah.
So, given that,
Yeah.
so then I'm just thinking across the kingdom sense. Classified as animals, then is it that it would be morally incorrect for an animal to cause harm to another animal? For instance, I'm thinking there are animals which are obligate carnivores.
Yeah.
So for them to continue their existence, they have what I must assume is non-consensual harm to another animal.
Yes, yes.
So I'm thinking, so does that mean that even though they're not thinking about what is my moral obligation, we expect, then does it mean that they would have some sort of moral obligation to not harm another animal, even if it would mean for them it would be harmful?
Yeah. So two things. The one is that I don't think that a lot of non-human animals are moral agents who have the kind of, right, who can be morally responsible for things. I don't think that's true of all of them. I do think there are some non-human animals probably are moral agents, even robustly. But that being said, this is an interesting problem in the animal ethics literature, sometimes called the problem of animal predation or the problem of carnivorous animals. And more or less the structure of it is like, okay, if you think these animals matter and they're going to start tearing one another to pieces, right? Shouldn't you intervene in some sort of way? Now, the puzzle, I think, that comes out in the literature is on the one hand, you have people who have this really robust view of animal value and rights, who are like, yes, we should intervene. But on the other hand, then they get to the point of justifying intervening, and then they're like, but wait, we'd have to kill all the carnivores, and like that doesn't seem right. And there's part of me as a pacifist that wants to be like, I know how to have your cake and eat it too. I know how you can argue for a certain kind of intervention, but rule out certain forms of intervention, right? Certain forms of violent intervention that would be, like in principle impermissible, which is to say, I think that, right, if I used to have 2 dogs, and if they fought, I think I'm obligated to intervene to prevent them from hurting one another needlessly. I don't think I'm permitted to harm one of them in the course of, right, at least intentionally or knowingly harm one of them in the course of breaking up their fight. So that's a case even though where I don't think that they're wronging each other. I do think that I do something wrong if I don't come to their aid. In the same sort of way that, like, if a tree falls on you when you're out for a walk, I can't be like, well, it's not the tree's fault. The tree is an immoral agent, so I don't have a duty to rescue you. I still have a duty to rescue you. And it seems to me that I have a duty to rescue and prevent these animals from harming one another in this way, even if neither animal is responsible for it, right? But yeah, so that's just a little like glimpse into the ways in which I've thought about using pacifism as this like hammer that could kind of create a middle ground here for these various views. Because I'm not attracted to either sort of extreme. It's weird to hear a pacifist say that I'm not attracted to extremes. There are some extremes I'm not attracted to, right? And those are the extremes of like strict non-interventionism, right? Anytime animals are harming one another, you just go, not my problem, right? I have no obligation to intervene, versus total radical intervention in nature where we wipe out our, obligate carnivores, right, or omnivores. Both of those seem like the wrong approaches to me.
Or the general will protect it against cute.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Hi.
Thanks for your talk.
Thank you.
A lot of ideas fired into my head, but so you've used examples of violence that are obvious, right? A bomb, a punch, right? They're physical, they're obvious. What about when harm or violence or pain is mediated by perception? So I'm thinking of like a classroom, right? We're having a lecture, a student flips out privately, we don't perceive it. What happens to perception in your theory? Is it accounted for, or is it always kind of obvious forms or physical forms?
Yeah.
Like what is a psychic harm or psychic violence?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So if the question is question about kinds of harms, because you talk about obvious harms, right? So you're thinking about harms that are internal and may not be as easily noticed.
Yeah, like a.
You give a lecture that's triggering to a student and they're having a post-traumatic like episode in class, but undiscernibly. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I think that is the kind of case in which you are harming them. I think you're harming them in a really like, it's clear that it's clear what the harm to them is. It may not be clear to you under the circumstances that you've harmed them. But I think this is also true with like kind of routine physical harms, right? I can kind of unknowingly physically harm people in ways that I just not aware of at all. I can step on someone's toes, right, and not be aware of it. Maybe they don't tell me anything. I'm a hugger, and I've hugged people in the past who later told me that I hugged them too tightly, and I had no idea, and they were like, yeah, it hurt a bit, you know, and I was like, I'm sorry, like, but I only found out later, right? I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm gonna like start hugging like this now, you know, like, so those were cases in which, yeah, I harmed people, but unknowingly, and so I guess in those circumstances, I would say like, yeah, I mean, ideally speaking, right, it would have been great had I known that, because then I shouldn't have done it, but given that I didn't know, I still think that it was probably wrong, but I'm just blameless, right, for having done it. I think if they tell me that, I owe them an apology. I should be like, I'm sorry, right? I'm sorry for doing that. I'm sorry for being the cause of your suffering in that way. But I don't think that they should have any sort of negative attitudes toward me as a person. Right, as a result of that.
So intentionality, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we know affects how we should be evaluated as agents. Like what we know under the circumstances, what's in our power under the circumstances, those kind of things all mediate the extent to which it's reasonable to blame us, praise us, adopt any number of moral attitudes towards us. But, yeah. And I mean, also regarding like just straight up physical harms, I mean, if there's one thing I think that war consistently teaches us is that we think we understand what the basic physical harm is going to be in people, but it's really difficult to anticipate what they're going to be long term. I mean, if anything, like years and years of being a warring empire has taught us is we have a lot of injured veterans who thought they were injured in one particular kind of way, but then it turns out they had a lot more problems going on, whether it's post-traumatic stress, shell shock, right? Things like this, moral injury, physical injuries from things like Agent Orange, right? That we didn't totally understand that come down the pike, right? Yeah.
We did have a couple more questions, but we're out of time, so maybe you guys can ask those questions directly to Blake.
Thanks.
So let's thank Blake.